most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks' arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 black female plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital for the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march rallied Americans to stand up against the continuing political and social injustices African Americans still faced 100 years after emancipation. The march took place at a critical moment in the civil rights movement. Tension and racial unrest had been building up throughout the year, with anti-segregation demonstrators making headlines in Alabama and President John F. Kennedy announcing his intention to pass civil rights legislation. The timing was right for a massive demonstration. Due to security concerns, internal marshals were trained to ensure order within the crowd. But as it turned out, the marchers chose peace, not violence, that sunny Wednesday. The event featured speeches from prominent leaders and musical performances by Josephine Baker, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Mahalia Jackson, and many others. The march is probably best remembered for Martin Luther King Jr.'s acclaimed "I Have a Dream" speech. But we bet you didn't know the real story behind those famous words. King was the last speaker that afternoon, but not because he chose to be. King only spoke last that day because no one else wanted to. When organizers of the march debated who would speak when and for how long, none of the other speakers wanted the last slot because they figured most of the news crews would head out by mid-afternoon. King agreed to go last and to limit his remarks to only 4 minutes. And he didn't have to worry about not making the news. The audience gladly stuck around for his 16-minute speech. And you might be surprised to learn that King hadn't even intended to talk about his now famous dream that day. During a pause in his prepared speech, Mahalia Jackson called out from behind the podium, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." She was referring to a theme King had touched on in a speech 2 months earlier in Detroit. Honoring her request, King departed from his prepared remarks and delivered the legendary speech we all remember today. Historians believe that the marches and King's speech were important catalysts in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today, a memorial marks the spot where Martin Luther King described his dream of a better America in one of the most influential and memorable speeches in American history.
Just 18 days after the March on Washington on Sunday, September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing occurred in Birmingham, Alabama.
It was the oldest black church in Birmingham, and it was fairly large. And so it made sense that meetings would happen there, which would also make it a target. On Sunday morning, September 15th, it was Youth Day, right after Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, and Cynthia Wesley are getting ready to go into the choir.
I remember Addie, I was closest to Addie. We would go to church picnics. Addie and I just gravitated to each other.
Cynthia Wesley was a friend of mine. She was at my school. She was a 9th grader. Just started in September. And I was an 11th grader.
I remember Denise back there always smiling, and she was the only child. And I remember Carol Robinson being quiet. She played in the orchestra at her school.
Addie Mae's sister Sarah is also in that ladies' lounge. Sarah said the last thing that she remembers is seeing them helping each other tie on sashes, and then it went dark. We're talking about an explosion that reverberates through the entire city of Birmingham. Everybody heard it.
I was at South Illerton Baptist Church, and our pastor was shifting kind of nervously across the room and said he had received word that 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed.
I was in Sunday school class. The building seemed like it was shaking off its foundation. Fumes, smelling fumes, and getting hit in the head. I couldn't find my younger sister. Only later to find out that she was taken to the hospital. She was only 4. She was cut in the head, blood dripping down her clothes and down her face.
Reverend John Cross comes down after the explosion to go into the hole and hears moaning.
My father heard somebody saying, Addie, Addie, and he realized that Sarah was calling her sister's name because that's the last voices that she heard before the explosion occurred.
They find the bodies, and they're almost literally stacked on top of each other.
He said they looked like they had been blown together.
It devastated me. It was just so painful to know that these girls were killed at church. They had not done anything to deserve something like that.
That was enough to pull people off the fence. Kids are supposed to be safe at church. This is not supposed to happen in America. We're above this kind of thing. And so this was the catalyst to get some things moving.
Sarah Collins is the lone survivor of the 5 little girls who were in the basement bathroom of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, readying for Sunday school on September 15, 1963. That morning, a deadly bomb was detonated by a splinter KKK group, murdering 4 little girls. Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Sarah's big sister, Addie Mae Collins. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church by the KKK was the tipping point of the civil rights movement, which sought to obtain equal voting rights for African Americans and indeed all people of color. Sarah was only 12 years old when her right eye was ripped away as a result of the bombing. Shards of glass permanently disfigured her face and body, taking away her dreams of birthing children. The resulting many years of PTSD she suffered from this despicable act of hatred also ended her aspirations of becoming a nurse. She continues to travel across the country and world to give her testimony and truth of how love, forgiveness, and faith, in the face of impossible odds, yield not only personal healing, but communal reconciliation.